I've got one or two things on the go, a few companies, a project. So when I found myself on Cortez, I thought this was my opportunity. I would have an intense hour of calm. So I got up early and with the sunrise began to walk the beach. And if you've been anywhere along the BC coast, you know it's unspeakably beautiful and in some parts kind of a little desolate and empty and untouched of humanity, and the vistas are almost endless. And as the sun was coming up and kind of a mist formed, I suddenly noticed in the distance this kind of figure. It seemed a little like a mirage heading towards me, and for a second I thought I was in a Sergio Leone movie and that the man with no name was going to come at me, and indeed he kept coming. And this figure kept coming, and then purposefully, you know, I looked around behind me to see if there might be someone else, and it was clear that he was heading my way. And then as he got close to me, I stopped, I looked at him. He seemed like an apparition, and he said, "I'm the Oyster Man." I'm not making this up. He said, "I'm the Oyster Man," and pulled out a kind of platter with a whole bunch of oysters. He had a shucking knife. And then out of his knapsack, out came a bottle of champagne. Chilled. Pretty good vintage. It's like, I don't know, 5 in the morning, and I'm all alone. I didn't know what to expect. And that's when I met Brent Petkau. So have a look at this.
Growing oysters is mariculture, and mariculture requires that there be good husbandry. And when the tide is out, you have this ability to see your oysters and you can work with them. And the ability for me to be working the wild sea and making sure that they're feeding right. And my hands are always touching these and thinning them and working them, putting them into different tidal pools to achieve that certain flavor, because every oyster tastes different. Every oyster has its own individual qualities, and you have to work with them. And to be able to be a person who is working with all of these little creatures and placing them in their right spots and thinning them out and making sure that they're perfect when they go to market is just one of the joys of being an oysterman. It's wild one minute, but another moment it's very nurturing, very calm and giving and loving. A great oyster responds to that kind of love. Sweetness, saltiness, savoriness, these things all come together. And the perfect oyster is the embodiment of umami. And it's almost like a crescendo. It's like it's peaking. As a life force, it wants to be sucked back. Oh, those colors are so rich. deliciousness, this flavor of completeness, that it also is a framework. It can guide you then to look into your palate, your inner being, your relationships with your lover, with your family, with your community. It simply works. And that's what the perfect oyster is about. It's simply a completeness. Great. A great oyster is usually associated with a great experience. The oyster is the ultimate social food. There's a sexual element of eating oysters with your friends and with your lovers that can offer a form, a quality of eroticism that fulfills you. And that this comes from a beautiful creature out of the sea. The pure aesthetics, the pure form, every oyster that I open, it is an experience when I open up and I look into the oyster and I can see the folds, I can see it's very sexual. And to put that to your lips, something that is appears so vaginal. The best way that I can describe in few words what the perfect oyster tastes like is to describe having an orgasm and you're very happy, you're very fulfilled, and you have given, but you've also taken love. That is the perfect oyster.
So you can imagine when this guy comes out of nowhere, offers the oyster, brings out the champagne and says, "I'm the oyster man. I'm in search of the perfect oyster. Come join me in the oyster revolution." I thought about it a long, long time and said, "I'm in." He's here to recruit you.
Good afternoon. First off, I want to give recognition and thank you to Craig Noble, who's in the audience, the filmmaker, because he captured over quite a number of days, it's a 6-minute movie, but the challenge for him to capture me doing my thing out on my oyster beds was a big one, and so I greatly appreciate being able to put it onto film, because I have a story to tell. And the story that I want to relate is I want to use the tools of the day. I want to use mediums like film. I want to use print. I want to use every opportunity when I'm shucking oysters that I can look into the eyes of someone and I can communicate. I can have a relationship with that person. And yes, the world of the oyster for me, it is my passion. And I'm very grateful that I have a passion. And I want to share with you that the world of having a passion in your life, it's what we need in this day and age where I think we're in some challenging times. As an oysterman, I see how the fisheries, we've outfished our oceans. And when I see the population of the world, how it's rising and we need food, and we need good food, we need lusty bits of nourishment that is going to truly sustain us, but not just feeding us with food that is mediocre and food that is essentially has no flavor, has no body, has no texture, has no history. The oyster for me It leads me to discussion, it leads me to contemplation, it leads me to sensual delight, but it also leads me here to ideacity and to meet folks like you. And so a few of the things I want to talk about with the oyster, and the oyster is a strange creature. It's unlike a fish. It has a huge heart. It doesn't have eyes, it doesn't look back at you, it doesn't struggle when you shuck it. But the one thing that it does demand of you is that you care about the oyster. And you have to care about how it's presented. Because if it's not cared and treated with respect, it will stink like a fish. And it will not be a pleasant experience. And so throughout the age now, and the oyster has adorned the table of the rich and the poor for thousands of years. And to put the oyster into context in the sense of perfection, the oyster was perfect hundreds of millions of years ago, well before the whales made it into the water. The whales were still on land when the perfect little oyster, and the oyster hasn't changed in millions of years. So I take my cue. I want to be associated with something that is so, well, vaginal in appearance. It sustains me. I found my passion. And these are the qualities about an oyster. And an oyster, what I love about it is that it demands that you give it the attention. And to be an oyster farmer, it requires the extra work. To be an oyster purveyor, whether or not you're Rodney Clark or Oyster Boy or Starfish, there is professionalism. You have to have that extra touch. And if you don't have that, you're not going to have a great oyster experience. And this is what I love about challenging us in this day and age. I'm not just producing seafood. For me, from the first oyster that I grew and I sold, and by now it's millions of oysters that I grow and I fondle and I love every one of them. What I love about this whole world of the oyster is it's challenging me, but it's going to challenge all of us. Do we want to live in a world that is mediocre? Do we want to live in a world that doesn't care? Do we want to live in a world that is so status quo? And the difference between, in my opinion, the difference between that which is mediocre and that which is exceptional and that which is passion-filled, it just requires that extra 20%. And often, that is all it takes. And when all of us, it's not something that special, you have to find something that you love. You have to find something that you care about. And what I'd like to challenge all of us is to have this love affair with the oceans, with community, with the broader world, and that the love affair also is where are we going into the future? The perfect oyster for me is all about stretching the imagination. I'm an idealist, but I'm also quite a pessimist. And the world that I want to live in is one where I want to live towards enlightenment. I want to be in a world of where community and everybody are at their happiest. They're most content, they're most fulfilled. And by all means, that is something that will elude us forever. But the process, and it's the process towards the perfect oyster, where I'm constantly trying to grow it, I'm trying to market it, I'm trying to shuck it. And it requires that you give it that extra care. It requires that you give it that extra love. And I would say that if all of us, no matter what we are doing in life, if you take that simple act of caring and loving and respecting and throwing a bit of passion towards that which you find. For me, my muse is the oyster. For me, I've fallen in love with them. And I have something that I can share with you. But it doesn't mean that you can't use the same thing with playing the violin or writing poetry or being a gas jockey. But it requires that you give it the extra care. And the rewards that come from that type of relationship. And this is it's so removed from the world of how seafood is being harvested, how it's being treated. For the most part, the world of seafood right now is commodity. They're units. And no one is really giving much of a care for stocks, the sustainability of it all. And the oyster is one of these things that truly will allow people around the world to live with seafood, live with something that is actually very easy to grow. It's not a big issue. For me, to bring on more mouths to feed, providing that I'm paid a fair living. And so this is that world that I think we have to be very cautious of. And for me, it's a bit of a mark in the road. When I saw the three-dimensional printer yesterday, and I'm thrilled at that, all kinds of new jewelry and women's heels on their shoes, and applications are endless. And also with the world of making food in a petri dish. Like I'm intrigued by it all. But the one thing I will not compromise on, and I hope none of us compromise on, that when it comes to soul food, we never allow, until the day that we've simply used up all our options, but we haven't come close to that. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever that we should even think of putting an oyster into a petri dish and let it grow without the heart and the soul. And there's no reason that we have to have an apple that isn't really an apple. All you have to do is support the farmers, support the fishermen, support your communities, and walk the talk. And walking the talk, I guarantee you, will give you that extra little step in the zinc in your pencil, the love of your life, and these are the qualities that I hope that we have in a few minutes' time. There's going to be oysters served, and when you put a good oyster to your lips, you know immediately whether or not it's a good one. And if it's not a good one, please demand that it is a great one. It's that simple. And I think back to this thing about this love affair that I have. The day that the oysters are no longer plentiful, and this city, I can't speak highly enough about how this city is so lucky to have Rodneys, oyster boys, starfish, the gentlemen who have the same kind of passion that I have, and these characters are revolutionary heroes in the food world. And it takes just half a dozen people to feed millions of hungry souls. And the day that you do not have oysters in Toronto, and the day that you don't have oysters in the Gulf because of an oil spill, and you're eating spam or you're eating something out of a petri dish, be insulted, be angry, because you can do better than that. And on that note, what I'd like to suggest is that the potential that we all here have, in the spirit of making the world everybody's oyster, have a great day.
So, Brent, let's slip the big surprise. When we exit at the end of this session, there'll be some oysters waiting for you. But, before you go, I came across this thing. I thought you might touch on it, but it says, wild oyster reefs are thought by some experts to be the most severely impacted marine habitat on Earth.
Not the most severe. I actually believe that the prairies, where agricultural farmland is the most altered. When it comes to the oceans, yes. Between 1850 and 1900, the oyster beds around the world were phenomenal. And this is where the city of New York, truly in 1850, everywhere you found oyster houses. You found oysters because off of Staten Island, you had oyster beds that were so huge. And off of the Thames River in England, off of Australia, off of Sweden. And so the stocks have been depleted greatly. But one of the dreams I have, and I wish that I'd actually have all day talking about the oysters. And I'm a man of few words. The reality of it all is that, and I'm privy to knowing what it takes to grow an oyster. I'm connected with oyster promoters around the world. The dream I have is that we can restore and we can humanly get back to that level of oyster stocks around the world that are back to the level of what they were back in the early 1800s. And you can do that when you have a population that is willing to buy them at a fair price, and fall in love with them. And so that dream that I have to be able to have, and I think nature is giving us a second chance, because you can't do it with timber, you can't do it with the fisheries, but with an oyster, you can grow an oyster in 2 to 3 years. And so that dream that I have of seeing the stocks around the world, and once we get back to these historic levels, then the idea of sequestering carbon, the ability to produce pearls en masse, the ability to feed humanity, and the oyster is truly got great potential, as all of you do as well.
Take a picture.